Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that nice introduction. And thank you all for coming on this terrible, cold night. I'm sort of a Jimmy Buffett wannabe who lives in northern New England, so these nights aren't really my favorite. Anyway, I've been asked to speak for a brief 3 hours tonight to explain to you the quandaries in the ocean. And it's not exactly the quandaries in the ocean right at this particular moment, but it's the backstory, okay? It's the backstory. I'm a professor of history at the University of New Hampshire, and for 10 years I was one of the two principal investigators of an interdisciplinary project there. The other guy is an ecologist, fisheries biologist. I'm a historian. And what we did is we got this group together to try to ask questions, maybe even answer those questions that could not be answered by people who had training in only one discipline. There was questions that were about the past, so, you get a historian, but they're also about the living ocean. We'll get a biologist. So it was like an arranged marriage. It was a little ugly at times, but we worked together over 10 years, and so the results here, I wrote the book, I wrote every word in the book, but Christmas is coming up, I know. Isn't Christmas coming up? And you're all going to want to buy this book for your friends and relatives. So I wrote the book, but it could not have been done without that collaborative project of a lot of other people as part of my team. So here's the question the Newsweek magazine asks, are the oceans dying? Okay? It's a question that not very long ago would have seemed incomprehensible, unfathomable, actually. Are the oceans dying? But then to read the newspapers, listen to the talk shows, go down to work. It's like, who's in worse shape, the fishermen or the fish? And how did we get into this mess anyway? When I was a kid, and even when I was in my 20s and got out of college and first started shipping out, the idea that the living ocean could be threatened was unimaginable. And men against the sea meant those who were willing to go to sea and risk themselves, sometimes in a sailing ship or a motor ship in God's great ocean. Men against the sea didn't mean people that were hammering its resources and changing its very structure. Where we sit, some of you have heard about these problems in the ocean. So where we sit, it's pretty easy to blame modern technology and imagine that these ecological problems they're recent. They're our lifetimes. They're post-World War II. This is an artifact of big steel ships or polyester nets or GPS, fish finders. Okay, and it's sort of easy to say, well, things were really pretty good until pretty recently, and it's just modern technology, big business that screwed it up. And it's often pretty easy to look back to a scene like this. All right, first quiz of the night. Who painted this picture? Oh, you guys are good, man. We're in the backyard, right? This is Homer, Prout's Neck, 1885. He called it the fog warning. And, you can see his schooner there on the horizon, the fog banks coming in, and he's rolling. It's like, ooh, it's scary out here. And sometimes this image is trotted out to represent traditional fisheries. And what I say to you as a historian, there was nothing traditional about this in 1885 at all. To begin with, the guy is out there in a stinking little dory. Oh, now let's think about this. 1885. Men had been fishing the Gulf of Maine and the Grand Banks, the Gulf of St. Lawrence for about 350 years at that point. Hand lining, just going over the rail from their ship, 10 to 2 hooks or 4 hooks. By the middle of the 1500s, they're landing 100,000, by 1700, 150, 200,000 metric tons of cod every year, hand lining. It was dangerous enough. The thought of leaving the mothership and going out in some stinking little rowboat in the middle of the North Atlantic, why, that was lunacy. But around the 1850s, they started doing that. Why? Well, it turns out they weren't catching as many fish as they wanted by staying on the safety of their ship or their schooner. So they decided to extend their hook footprint. They're just a hook-line fishermen. But they extend their hook footprint by going out from the mothership in smaller boats to get more hooks and more area. You got the idea? So this wasn't traditional. Oh, and then the fish. Since you did so well on the artist, what kind of fish do we got here? Halibut. largest member of the flounder family, okay? This fish, until the 1840s or so, was a trash fish. Just like when we were kids, monkfish was trash. Who would eat one of those things? Monkfish. Well, today, though, you go to a high-end restaurant, you pay a lot for monkfish, right? Used to be just pitchfork them over the rail, because who the hell's going to eat one of those things? Halibut, they were encountered by Captain John Smith. They were encountered by everybody along the way. Nobody wanted a halibut. So for 220 years or whatever, they ignored them. They pitched them over the side. They bopped them on the head. They cursed at them. But they sure as hell didn't land them and take them home because nobody wanted them. Halibut was redefined as a cash fish from a trash fish in the 1840s. But by 1885, when this picture was painted, halibut had become the buffalo of the ocean. You know, the American bison story. You know, they went from what, 60 million to 30,000 in the space of a human generation. Halibut, 1885, Homer's painting, the one that people trot out as traditional. The Gloucester halibut fleet couldn't catch halibut anymore in 1885 on George's Bank. They were all gone. They couldn't catch halibut anymore in the Gulf of Maine. They were all gone. They couldn't catch halibut anymore in Newfoundland, or the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They were all gone. That Gloucester halibut fleet, when Homer penned this, was going to Greenland and Iceland to make their halibut trip. So rather than looking at this as a timeless picture of how it used to be, it's just one of the many snapshots along the way. You go from that time of unfathomable abundance when Samuel de Champlain or John Smith sailed these coasts and wrote down what they saw, to the tattered remnant of this ocean ecosystem that we live with today. So my book has approximately 3,246 of these little snapshots along the way, little pictures in time about how things change. That's what I do. I reconstruct things from evidence. So rather than saying that this is a timeless scene, it's historically specific. For a long time, until pretty recently, the combined heft of history and literature and science suggested that the sea was immortal. But by 15 years ago when I started this project, I was realizing that that was no longer the case. So I thought as a historian, I wanted to reconstruct what people in the past had done, honor them on their own terms, try to find out how they dealt with stuff every day the way we do. But I also wanted to write a story that would go long enough in time to show changes in the ocean. So that's ultimately what the book is about. Most of the book is really about the 400 years from 1520 to 1920. This is sort of from arrival in the New World by Europeans up until World War I. It's the long build-up to industrialized fishing. Basically, this book is about pre-industrial fishing. It's about sailboats and rowboats. It's about hooks and lines and handheld harpoons. And nevertheless, people still made a huge impact on the ocean. Pre-industrial. So that's the story you're going to hear tonight. And we only got 2 hours and 45 minutes to go. Okay, so the Vikings were the fishmongers to Western Europe. I'm not going to cover much of that tonight, but it's if you find a picture like this, you want to put it in the book, and you got to write something about it, right? It's just such a cool picture. So the Vikings are really the fishmongers to Western Europe, and they changed Western Europeans' eating habits with the relationship to the sea from the late 700s through the 800s, 900s. That's the Viking era in Europe. And if you're short on time, I'll cut right to the chase. This is the takeaway message of this talk. As a historian, I can say to you that I feel that without genuinely historical perspectives, trying to understand the living ocean in terms of more time than just one human life or two human lives is really important. And that without that kind of historical perspective on changes, we have no idea of the magnitude of the restoration challenges we face. So ultimately, I wrote the book to draw attention to the plight of the living ocean and to explain how historically the situation had evolved to the point that we're in today. So, let's begin in the Little Ice Age. It was even colder than it is tonight. Renaissance seafarers show up here from Europe, okay? And they show up in the Gulf of Maine. You might recognize that's Cape Ann down there where Gloucester is, the Merrimack River, the Isles of Shoals, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, blah, 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 the mid-coast of Maine here, Kennebec River. Okay, I'm sorry, Kennebec River up on this end. So we basically have Casco Bay and southern coast of Maine. What did these European guys find? Well, they found a marine ecosystem teeming with whales and fish, like the ones they'd seen at home. And then on shore, the land was totally different than anything that we know today. There was a hardwood forest on the uplands. It was just chestnuts, elms, oaks, maples, huge trees. A man could ride horseback full tilt through this forest because there was no kind of understory. There was a savanna, a coastal plain, a prairie of grasses that went from Portland, Maine, with the Saco River, that area, down to Connecticut, sometimes within 100 yards or 200 yards of the shore, sometimes within miles of the shore. This plain, this coastal prairie, was the home of the now extinct heath hen. The last heath hen died on Nantucket in the early 20th century. And then in the river bottoms were these massive white pine trees, larger trees than any of these guys had ever seen before. So it's a little ice age, the snow is deeper, the snowpack lasts longer because of the shade of these huge trees. And the soil itself is this spongy layer of humus decomposing leaves and branches and moss. And as it rains or the snow melts, the water runs through that dirt. It's like a filtration system. Filters out the impurities, and the streams run clear and cold, and there's perfect spawning habitat for salmon and shad and sturgeon and alewives in every one of these rivers. The main rivers like the Kennebec or the Piscataqua and all the little tributary streams had these spawning grounds for anadromous fish. The men found these creatures, the likes of which they knew from home. There was salmon and cunning little harbor seals, and there were eider ducks and codfish and sturgeon. This was not like Columbus finding colored fish in the Caribbean. It was not like Magellan finding these huge clams or chambered nautilus in the Philippines. This was all stuff that everybody had seen in England or France or Denmark or wherever they happened to be. It was all familiar. But there was a lot more of it. The abundances of these organisms were tremendous, and the size of each individual organism. The lobsters were bigger than the lobsters in Europe. The sturgeon were bigger than the sturgeon in Europe. The codfish were bigger. And so it's like, oh. So these are mariners that are very experienced. The only reason they're still alive is because they're paying attention to their surroundings and they're taking good notes. We've been sometimes told that it was all propaganda. It's just propaganda trying to get them to come to the Americans. I make a pretty good case in this book. It was not propaganda and demonstrate why. But the point is, they had come into an ecosystem in which the North Atlantic boreal ecosystem, in which the organisms were like the ones they knew from home, but the abundances and the sizes were much, much greater. This image was made in 1720 to demonstrate the Newfoundland cod fishery, different stages of that fishery. By the time this was made in 1720, Europeans were catching between 150,000 and 200,000 metric tons of cod every year in this American system and bringing it back to Europe. Okay, so it was a very sustainable fishery. It turns out that that fishery was sustainable for many, many centuries. And about the same time as that, 1717, 1720, Archibald McFedris, a merchant in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This house is a couple hundred yards from where my wife and I live now. It's right on the other side of the Memorial Bridge. If you drive across the Memorial Bridge from Kittery, the old bridge into Portsmouth, this house is immediately on your right side. What street? I don't know. What street's that, huh? She says Daniel Street. Yeah, maybe. You drive across the bridge. You look to your right. McFedris wrote to a colleague in Ireland, "The river is full of salmon. That in the season you may take 1,000 tons here." I don't know if 1,000 tons was accurate or not, but his image was that the river ran silver every spring. And the salmon runs were extraordinary still in 1717, and you could make money catching fish, catching salmon in the Piscataqua. But, river fish like that swarm into the river. They're awful easy to take. You don't need a deep sea ship. You don't need a lot of complicated technology. And as early as 1755, earlier we have evidence already about how these river fisheries were beginning to get hit. The people living upon the banks of the Merrimack River observed that several species, such as shad, salmon, and alewives, are not so plenty in their seasons as formerly. So this is 1755 colonial America, and the settlers are already realizing that they're beginning to replicate the situation that had existed in the Europe from which they or their ancestors had fled. So check out these comments. Judge Chadbourne, South Berwick. Formerly, large fish such as salmon, bass, and shad came up the river, but they have forsook it. How charming. Now check this out. Judge Chadbourne was in his 60s when he wrote this. He had spent his whole life living in South Berwick. His house was about 3 miles from the Sturgeon Creek. But he didn't put sturgeon in his list of fish, salmon, bass, and shad, because by the time he was a little boy, the sturgeon were all gone. He'd never seen sturgeon in his own lifetime, even though he lived quite near Sturgeon Creek. You see where this is going. And then we have Jeremy Belknap, writing in New Hampshire, the 1790s. The striped bass was formerly taken great plenty in the Piscataqua, but this fishery was almost destroyed. It was in the 1790s that a visitor named Burkitt was in Portsmouth, right near where that great brick mansion was built, Daniel Street, I think. And he wrote to someone, "There is no salmon in this river." Oh. So in 1717, the merchant in the mansion says, "You can take 1,000 tons every spring." And by 1790, the visitor says, "There is no salmon in this river." Although upstream, it was called the Salmon Falls River. So people are making impacts already in the colonial period. In fact, by the time George Washington became the nation's first president, we can look to measurable changes in the nature of the coastal ocean. There are localized depletions, no sturgeon in Sturgeon Creek, no salmon in the Salmon Falls River. We can see range contractions, walrus. They used to come down and breed on islands off Nova Scotia. Walrus, is that in Nova Scotia? We think of walrus as Arctic creatures. They are Arctic creatures now, but in the 1600s and 1700s, they were as far south as Nova Scotia. Extinctions, the Atlantic gray whale, near extinctions, the great auk, diminished estuarine productivity. The point is, by the time Washington was inaugurated, settlers in this region, small in number, without any kind of real technology to speak of, had nevertheless made an impact on the coastal ocean. People know who this guy is? Oh, you guys are a good audience. This audience is informed. Here's the North American penguin, the great auk. 30 million years of evolution had streamlined them into being superb swimmers. They mated monogamously, we're told. It's always charming when we say that about creatures anthropomorphized. And they raised one egg each season between the two, and the male and the female took turns incubating the egg while they went to fish for the other one, and then they hatched the egg. But these birds, of course, couldn't fly, so they would breed on rocky islands off Newfoundland, like Funk Island, and then in the fall of the year, with the new group of adolescents, they would get into the water, and they would start to do this, and they would paddle all the way to Cape Cod, or all the way sometimes to Cape Hatteras, because like me, they didn't like this cold winter stuff. You know? And then they would fish down there, and then they'd turn around, and in the spring, they would go back all the way up to here or Newfoundland and have their babies. But because they couldn't fly, they were really easy to catch. And as the fishermen said, you can bait the hook of the cod fishery with a quarter of a sea fowl. Codfish were not fastidious about what they ate. And if you had herring, that was good. If you had salted clams, that was good. But if you had a bloody chunk of puffin or murre or great auk, that was good too. So the fishermen started to round up these guys on the islands where they couldn't fly away, or herd them into the ships, bop them on the heads, render them on the beach, cook them in their own fat, sometimes keep some of the feathers, but, use the fish for bait. In 1839, a Marblehead fisherman said, the mackerel are getting thinner. And if we're not careful about catching those mackerel in the spring when they're having their babies, they're going to become as gone as the penguins were. The penguins that used to be so common here at the time of the Revolutionary War. 5 years later, the very last of the great auks ever in the world was killed in Iceland, Elbe, Iceland, and then they were officially extinct. So if you want to see one, you can go to the couple of museums where they have stuffed auks, but they're gone. They're a casualty of the early fishery Okay. So let's move ahead a little bit. That was 1844. The great auks are extinguished. We're making a point at this time that humans are making an impact on the coastal ocean early on, even without much technology or population. So now we have fishermen like this guy. He's from York, Maine. Donnell, I think. Is it Donnelly? Donnell. I think it's Donnell. George Donnell, maybe? I think it's George Donnell with a basket of pollock. The picture is from a little bit later, but I'm going to use it to talk about the 1850s or 60s here. And just imagine, around the time of the Civil War, just before the Civil War, fishermen in Maine, Massachusetts, they are not using the word sustainability, but they are talking with a lot of concern about whether there would be fish for the future. And they are not using the word ecology, but they are talking a lot about relationships in the food web and the presence of forage fish and whether or not the conditions were right to keep cod and haddock and halibut, the species that they wanted, present. Okay? So these conversations are being heard in town halls and on the stages of fishing ports and schooner decks, and they begin to work their way into the public record. I gave a talk upstairs earlier today for the staff here, and one of the people who works here said later, how did you find the material for this book? I said, well, it's all right there. It's all like in the town meetings and the state papers and the federal records. It's like, what happened? Well, in the 1850s, when people in Maine and Massachusetts and Cape Breton and Newfoundland and Norway and England began to say, are we going to have fish for the future? Isn't there a problem? What's going on? They began to get the politicians involved, and they create a paper trail. And the paper trail just gets bigger and bigger as the years go by. The point is, the conversations that we are all having today about whether there will be fish for the future, what can we do to conserve them, who is at fault, how do we solve this problem, these conversations have been going on in the great state of Maine, Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Nova Scotia and elsewhere since the 1850s. So part of what this book is about is how we, as Americans and others, have been having the same conversation for 160 years. At some point, maybe we'll figure out that we should do something about it. Anyway, okay, so here. The intensity of these complaints increased dramatically during, there's a little red dot, These things are so pathetic. What I need is like a swordfish sword or a harpoon or something as a pointer, because you can't see the little red dot. I don't even know where it is. So the intensity of the complaints increased dramatically during the 1850s and 60s, a turning point. These are the first systematic concerns that people have had about humans making an impact on real sea fish. Everybody knew that you could whack the salmon and the shad and the sturgeon, the fish that came up the rivers to spawn. But now people are worried about mackerel, cod, menhaden. So why? What changed perceptions and attitudes at this time, 1850s, 1860s? We can talk here about a period of changes in the sea and a sea change in ocean in attitudes about ocean resources. We can also begin to point out that it was many fishermen themselves who are seeking regulation, because it was the fishermen who knew there was a problem. It was the fishermen who had skin in the game that wanted there to be fish for the future. It was the fishermen who insisted at first, we got a problem and we got to do something about it. Let me just buzz through very quickly for you some of the things that were going on in the middle of the 19th century, even like 1860s, 1880s, or whatever, a little tighter than this time scale. But, actually, this is funny. Here's a postcard from Warren, Maine. Alewife fishing on the Georges River. Some of you know the Georges River. You've been to Warren. Can anybody read the little sign here? It's so good. No, it says it's dump your rubbish over the dam. It doesn't say do not dump your rubbish. It says dump your rubbish over the dam. So what they're doing is they're catching alewives here, the alewife run, right? Putting them up in tubs. And then meanwhile, with some different sensitivities than we have, they're dumping your rubbish over the dam. Yeah. So this is early 20th century, just about a century ago. Okay. What was going on in the fisheries, besides dumping rubbish over the dam? What was going on in the fisheries in the middle of the 19th century to make some changes, okay? Again, real point. Sails, oars, hooks, lines, really simple by our standards, but nevertheless some changes. Number one, the mackerel fishery is expanding, and the mackerel fishery is expanding with bigger nets. All nets were handmade until the 1840s, and individually by fishermen. The first net company in New England was in the 1840s, but it's still guys sitting around making nets by hand. Then by the 1860s, you can get machine-made nets. It's like there's textile factories down in Lowell and Haverhill. Well, let's change this technology and weave twine and make mesh, make fish nets. Okay. So 1860s, we can now have machine-made nets. Well, the nets suddenly get much bigger. So we have schooners and seine boats and dories, but they're setting nets, and the nets are much bigger. So you can catch more fish with bigger nets. Number two, new species are being targeted. Menhaden, lobster, juvenile herring, called sardines, swordfish. None of these, halibut, none of these have been fished in the colonial period. Okay, there was no commercial market for any of this in the colonial period, but now in the 19th century, you can fish these heretofore underutilized species. New means of markings delivering seafood to consumer, railroad trains with ice on them, tin cans. Suddenly people in Cincinnati and St. Louis are eating out of the Gulf of Maine in a way that they had not before, except for the salted cod. Oh, and then if you're going to shift from that hand line business, just a couple of hooks per man, to setting out long lines that have 400, 500 hooks, you need a lot more bait. So the bait fisheries intensify, and pressure on menhaden and herring and clams. And now we have the beginnings of fishery science. We have early labs like this in Woods Hole, labs shortly thereafter in Booth Bay, Bolster, early fishery science laboratories. Why do they exist? There aren't enough fish. What are we going to do about it? Well, maybe we can get some scientists to help us solve the problem. These labs are getting going by the early 1870s, 1880s. Yeah, by 1900 they're booming. So we have these two guys, head of the U.S. Fish Commission, who are attributing the depletion of cod. They all admitted by the 1870s that cod are in tough shape. I mean, Spencer Bear here says, yeah, restoring the salmon in Maine is important, but of trifling importance compared to restoration of our exhausted cod fishery. That's 1873. So these guys said the reason we don't have so many cod anymore is that all of the bait fish, the shad and the alewives, have been hit because the rivers have been dammed up and the rivers have been polluted, and these shad and alewives come in from the sea to have their babies, and now the door to the OB/GYN ward is closed because they got these dams, and they can't have their babies. And so if we can get more of these bait fish, that'll make more cod and haddock and the rest. So the beauty of this thesis is that these guys were going to engineer growing those fish in the lab. And they're going to release them back into the ocean, just the way the state today puts, fingerling trout into the streams in Maine and New Hampshire. This also allowed them to sort of ignore overfishing. They didn't have to try to go there. But some of the coastal fishermen didn't exactly agree with this. So we're back to the question I posed earlier. What led a generation of fishermen beginning in the 1850s to believe that fish were declining and that overfishing was part of the problem? Part of the answer comes out of an article that we published, this group that I was in from UNH I told you about, and our article is Modeling Cod Biomass Using Historical Records. It's in a science journal for years in ecology. Let me just show you a little bit of what we did. Here's a map of the region from the 1850s, over which we superimpose the modern management areas of the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization today, okay? And then we look at one boat. This is just one boat. Goes out of Beverly, Massachusetts, sails across the Gulf of Maine in the summer of 1853, fishing a little bit, fishes relatively hard in the western banks off Nova Scotia, and then fishes really pretty hard on Vancouver. This is the first half of the summer, and then they turn around and go home, unload, reprovision, and go out again. So it's 2 trips a summer, early spring into late fall. Well, it turns out that there's logbook records from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these schooners, and we were able to ultimately track hundreds of these schooners and get data from well over 1,000 of them, and put together some statistics and maps, including this map made by my colleague Stephen Clayson. This is the Beverly, Massachusetts fleet, the North Shore of Boston. Okay, here's the fleet. And where are they fishing? Well, are they fishing Georges Banks? Nope. Are they fishing the Gulf of Maine? Nope. Are they fishing the Gulf of St. Lawrence? Nope. Are they fishing the Grand Banks? Nope. They're going like back and forth on a bus run from the Nova Scotian shelf. It's the area they knew. It's the area they fished hard. The data that we have is so good. It's like you had a satellite up there with a data recorder. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. Okay. What did we find out? Well, the catch per unit effort, we calculated the catch per unit effort, and we ultimately were able to look at how many fish were landed over the decade of the 1850s. And the catches fell by about 50%. 50% over the space of that decade. And so at the very same time, the fishermen on shore are beginning to bitch that things aren't going so well. These offshore fishermen who are doing these whole long summer trips, they're coming home like half empty. This allowed the statisticians in our group as well, that does not include me, to calculate total biomass of cod on the Nova Scotian shelf in 1852, about 1.25 million metric tons. This is what the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada says the total biomass is more recently, which is less than 1.25 million metric tons. And I could talk about this graph some more if you want. The point is, what we were able to do is take historical data and marry it to modern population modeling methods. So you take modern population modeling methods, the kind of which you can model all sorts of populations, in this case fish. And you have to make assumptions about recruitment and retention and stuff. And you got to check your data going in to get it as clean as possible. But ultimately, we feel pretty confident about this paper. And what's interesting to me, just as a sidelight of justification for my team, is a totally different paper based on totally different methods and totally different data estimated that the carrying capacity of codfish on the Nova Scotian shelf was this black line, and our estimate of cod biomass, how much was actually there in 1852, is the blue line. So they sort of reinforce each other. A different story than today. Okay. All right. Well, so what's going on? 1850s, we're still there. I told you, it's a 3-hour talk. The Americans are blaming the foreigners. It's a classic strategy. You know, what's happening? Catches are going down. Americans are blaming the French who are coming in their square riggers, their big fishing machine. And the American captains are bitching. Fish very scarce. Say the French bothers us. They run their trawl. That's their long line all around us to get most of the fish. Notice this. No dories. One yawl boat. They're anchored on the banks or drifting, and they're all hand-lining around the rail. This is before the lunacy of leaving the mothership in dories, okay? This is still the 1850s, but things are about to change. I love this painting. This is Gloucester Harbor, Fitzhugh Lane. Wonderful image here. Hampton boat on the beach, a dory. Now look at these fish. You know, these are big haddock or codfish. These are 25, 30-pound fish stacked up on the beach. I mean, you can just tell it's not a photograph, but it might as well be a photograph by the size of everything else, you know, the size of the hats and the baskets and the rest. It's really a stunning scene, and it shows when he painted this in mid-century, you could still get trips like that out of Gloucester Harbor in small day boats. But everybody knew, despite that the depletions were occurring and that there was a need for conservation of fish stocks. More challenging. We know who this guy is? I might have finally stumped him. See, I didn't stump him. God, this is a crackerjack audience here. We've gone from Homer to Ox, and now we got pogies. This is the Menhaden, okay? The Menhaden, called commonly the pogie. They're a wretched, oily little cousin in the herring family. Clupidae. You know, herring are nice fish to eat, but you know, Menhaden, possibly the most important fish in the ocean. They're bony, they're oily. Humans don't like to eat them, but they're really important for 2 reasons. One, they're filter feeders. They won't take a baited hook. They won't eat big stuff, but they just swim through the water, filtering out plankton, detritus, and stuff. And they turn that immediately into little, fats and proteins and carbs in their own body, which makes them readily available to larger fish that like to eat them. And it turns out everybody likes to eat these menhaden. Okay, so these guys are like a direct translator from primary productivity, photosynthesis and plankton, to whales, sharks, tuna, ospreys, eagles, you name it. Okay, Menhaden had been ignored for a very long time. There were vast numbers. In 1819, a captain sailed into Portland, Maine, coming home from the West Indies, and he said he went through a school of menhaden that was 2 miles wide and 19 miles long. About the same time in New Haven, where they had Yale College, and everybody that goes to Yale College is smart and always tells the truth. They set a beach seine in New Haven Harbor, and in one set of the seine, 1,300,000 fish. Ooh. So these are massive schools of fish. They came into Chesapeake Bay, and Long Island Sound, and Casco Bay, and they would swim right up into the dooryard, and they were basically ignored for most of the colonial period. And then around the time of the Revolution in Rhode Island, people put a few of them in the farms to act like manure, but they're still largely being ignored. And then somebody in Rhode Island starts to boil a little oil, but again, here in Maine, they're being totally ignored. But in 1850, in Blue Hill, some of you know Blue Hill. In 1850, in Blue Hill, this elderly lady named Mrs. John Bartlett began the Menhaden Wars that would sort of rage up and down the coast. This is what happened. She kept hens. Anybody here ever keep poultry? Got chickens? I had chickens for a long time. They love protein, especially in the winter. They got to eat protein. So her husband and son would go out in a little rowboat, and they'd set a little handmade gill net, and they'd catch some menhaden, pogie, and then she'd boil them up and feed this fish slather to her hens. But the oil rose to the top of the pot, and being a thrifty housewife, she poured that oil into bottles. And that summer of 1850, she went down to the westward in a schooner and went to Boston, and there was this oil merchant named Evan Phillips, and he said, I'll give you $11 a barrel. That's some real money in mid-coast Maine. So she goes home, says to her husband and son, $11 a barrel. And they go out and catch some more pogies, and she boils them up, and they put them in barrels. And then the next summer, Evan Phillips, the oil merchant, comes to the coast, and he equips their family and a few others with those screw lever presses, the kind used to make cider. You know, you put the apples in, and you put the thing down, and you screw it down, you press, and the oil going, apple cider comes out. So now they're boiling the fish on the beach and pouring off the oil, and then taking the fish mash before they give it to the hens, and putting in these press machines. You know, it's all hand done. Screwing lever, more oil, $11 a barrel. Well, they thought they were doing pretty well. Yeah, oil. You know, we've always been oil-hungry people. You can use oil for lubrication. You can use it for lighting. You can put it in paint. You can use it to lubricate rope. I mean, there's a whole host of applications for fish oil, and whale oil, and petroleum oil, and olive oil. First American oil guys were not Texans. They were Puritans collecting dead whales on Cape Cod. So we always get the jump on those Texans. All right, so Mr. and Mrs. Bartlett are making some fish oil. Big deal. Now think about this. People in the mid-coast of Maine, for a long time, since they lived there, they had small boats, and they'd go out to a place like Eggemogan Beach, and they would catch some codfish or haddock, and they'd bring them back into shore. And a shoreman would split, gut the fish, spread them out to dry, and salt them, right? And you put them in a barrel, and you send them off to the west, and they give you money. And then people took mackerel, and they went out in small boats, and they caught mackerel right close to home, and they came back on shore with the mackerel, and they gutted the mackerel and headed them and put them in barrels that had a brine solution in it, tickled the mackerel, and sent that off to the west, and they got money. And now Mrs. Bartlett and her husband and son and a few neighbors are now going out in little boats, and they're catching some menhaden, and they're boiling the oil and putting the oil in barrels and sending it off to the west, and they're getting money. Sounds like this is what you do in the mid-coast of Maine. But what happened? The neighbors went ballistic. There are thousands of fishermen that signed petitions on the mid-coast of Maine in the 1850s suggesting that this was nefarious. So 150 guys from Booth Bay, in the first petition I found, taking menhaden by means of seines in our bays, rivers, and harbors is destructive to said fish, and if persist will drive them from our coast. Oh, and then Deer Island Sedgwick guys. Catching menhaden in vast quantities was taken last year will drive them from the bays and harbors to the disadvantage of the cod and the mackerel fishing. When I first stumbled into these petitions, and there's a whole lot of them in Augusta, I'm driving up there from Fort Smith for the day, spending my time in the archives, going through all these papers about fisheries, trying to capture them. And I'm finding this stuff, and I don't know what it means, but I'm Xeroxing it, get my coffee, driving home. There was a tizzy on the mid-coast in the 1850s about menhaden, and I couldn't really understand what was going on. Now, some guy said, chill out, calm down, it's no problem. Fears of a dearth are entirely hypothetical. Free trade in pogies. Good slogan. But for the most part, it's like the dudes in Gouldsboro that are fearing the material injury of the cod fishing interests. So I didn't really know yet what it meant. It took me a little while, but just bear with me. I'm going to tell you what's going on. In 1864, right towards the end of the war, the first factory was built in Maine to extract oil from menhaden fish, built right at South Bristol, near where the Harvey Gammon shipyard is now. And then in 1870, we have the first steamboat, powerboat in the American fishery ever. It's in Rhode Island for the menhaden fishery. But by 1877, 25 years after Mrs. Bartlett has created this tizzy with her hens, we have a fleet of 43 steamers in Maine. So basically, in a very short time, 1850, she starts making oil, and then we have industrialized oil production, and now a big fleet of boats. Okay. Fishermen capitalized on the fact of nature. When the menhaden got to Maine, they'd been feeding on plankton all the way up the coast, and they were fat. So if you caught that same fish 2 months earlier in New Jersey, just a scrawny little thing, not much to it. But you wait till August, and you catch that fish off Booth Bay, fat and sassy, more oil. Okay? So they start processing oil here in Maine. 1879, no menhaden. 1,000 men out of work. Whole fleet shut down. Towns prospered. What happened? Well, no menhaden north of Cape Cod that year. No menhaden north of Cape Cod for the next 6 years. We are talking serious capital investment now. Sitting idle. So I started investigating. What was going on? Well, it turns out that in the previous years, people had been taking as many menhaden out of the system from Virginia or the Carolinas all the way up to Maine in these little boats, sailboats, and these little initial steamboats, as they would at any point in the next 60 years. 1878, the year before the fishery crashed, people took as much menhaden out of the system as they would at any time in the next 60 years. But in the next 60 years, the boats got much bigger, and the same boats became motorized instead of guys pulling oars. And they got spotter aircraft to find the schools of fish. In other words, the technology ramped up a lot. The effort expended to catch those fish was much more, and yet it was the same amount they were catching these little bitty boats in 1878, right before the population crashed. What we have here is the first instance of what would become the pattern for American fisheries for the future. A species long ignored, redefined as valuable, hit hard until the population collapsed, and then the fishermen pulled back because you couldn't make any money for a while. That lets the population come back to some extent, and then you start fishing again, but it never comes back to a level at which it had reproduced before. And it turns out that when these guys were bitching about this menhaden boiling in the 1850s, they were scared. They felt they were already at the tipping point with the mackerel fisheries and the cod fisheries. And they complained. And you know what? They were right. And here's how we know it. In 1861, fishermen took about 70,000 metric tons of cod out of the Gulf of Maine. First year of the Civil War, 70,000. By 1870, about 10 years later, it was less. By the 1920s, it was down to about 25,000 tons. That was still all hopes and love. Then they started dragging and went down to 10,000 tons. And now today, the numbers are pathetic, but in the last few years they were very small. The point here is that the tipping point had been reached in the 1850s. And the fishermen at the time were aware of it, and they complained, which is why the paper trail existed and has allowed me to have this career. I really can't those guys. But they were not looking at the future, so I could stand in front of this room and talk at you people. They were scared to death that their livelihood was disappearing and that the ecosystem on which they depended was collapsing. Okay, but we all know that sometimes people don't tell the truth. And we also know that it's difficult for historians looking back to find out who is telling the truth and how do we correlate between what people said and what was really going on. So it turns out that if you want to look at the inshore Gulf of Maine cod fishery, which I did because I'm that kind of guy, Monhegan Island here, some of you know Monhegan, you've been out to Monhegan, here's the fish flakes, the drying flakes. But again, you can see the size of the boats in the harbor here that we're talking about for this inshore cod fishery. Okay, these are small boats. Circa 1860s. What do we have? Well, here's a logbook. The image is a little light, but each line is a day. This is for one boat, of course. Each line is a day. And then you get the men's names over here and how many fish they caught each day. And we know where these boats were operating. So we have correspondence between some of the fishing towns, like Boonesboro, and some of the banks on which they were fishing. And it turns out that the boats from Frenchman's Bay, that's one of the customs districts up near Bar Harbor, you know that, were basically fishing in this red zone. My friend Bill Leavenworth made this slide to show where the range, where these boats could go if they're fishing out of Frenchman's Bay. So, cutting to the chase here. A few years ago, I was giving a variation of this talk in Rockland at the Island Institute. Some of my colleagues were there. And I put this slide up, and a woman gasped. And then she introduced herself to the room, and she said, "I'm Cindy Smith." Is Cindy Smith here tonight? Okay, she can't correct me. Cindy Smith had run the trawl survey for the state of Maine for, 10 or 12 years at that point. You know, that's a survey in which you go out spring and fall, and you tow the same gear for the same amount of time, the same place, and you count everything, and you keep records. We've been doing this at the federal and state level since the 1960s. There have been some wrinkles along the way, but basically the idea is to get a baseline. I put this slide up, shows cod landings from Frenchman's Bay, okay, from March to November of 1861, and it's 148,000 cod. And she gasped because she said, "I've been running the trawl survey for the state for the last 15 years. There's no cod in Frenchman's Bay at all, none." And I said, "Well, in 1861, there were at least this many. Maybe they caught them all." So the point is that when those guys were complaining, and they felt that everything was going to hell already, and they were up in arms to get their politicians to get involved, and starting the State of Maine Fish Commission and the Federal Fish Commission and all this other blather that created the paper trail so I could give you this talk, they thought things were in deep, deep doo-doo already. And yet today, people in the industry would say, "Oh, well, if they can catch 148,000 cod in Frenchman's Bay with hand lines, it's pretty good." That's the magnitude of changes that we're looking at here. And this isn't that, there's some people in this room, I bet, whose grandparents were alive at that point, okay? It's really not that long ago. So, out of Frenchman's Bay, we got that many cod that summer, and it turns out, some extrapolations I can go into if people want later, but estimated cod landings in the whole Gulf of Maine, 62 to 78,000 metric tons of cod every year. 1861, 1862, 1863, 1871, 65, 70,000 metric tons every year. Pretty good, small boats, huh? Okay, today, here's some more recent landings. So there's not like 65,000 metric tons. No, it's less. Yeah. And, now, right at this particular moment, as you know, there's been some pretty serious closures, and we're talking about a quota of maybe 365 metric tons. 365 metric tons. Okay. What appears to us is the fishery is flourishing. Contemporaries did not see it that way. They were convinced that they had a problem, and they were lobbying to reduce overfishing and save their cod, and it was the fishermen who were out there in front as the conservationists complaining that there was a problem. Now, they wanted to have it both ways. As fishermen, they wanted to keep fishing, but as fishermen, they knew that there was a problem, and they wanted to make it better. So there were these laws introduced, quite a few of them. Here's Jotham Johnson, Freeport, Maine. "If there's not something done to prevent this wholesale destruction, farewell to our fishery on the coast of Maine." Prognostications from a rustic fellow in 1865. Fishermen request the legislature to prevent trawl fishing, by which they meant long lines. So we all look back and we say, wow, those landings were great. Those landings were super. But at the time, those landings were perceived by people to be very problematic. In other words, they knew that in their childhood or when their fathers were fishing, it had been much better. So it turns out the conservation sentiment was at its height among Maine fishermen in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A number of laws were passed to restrict steining and limit mackerel fishing, and ultimately to, a little later, save the lobster fishery from killing itself. But there is a clear realization among people that there was a problem and they should try to address it. Halting efforts, but trying. To me, this is the most chilling slide in the show. It speaks about the place where I live right now. I'm very familiar with Portsmouth Harbor. Fishermen, as we know, adapted new gear. So what do we see here? Portsmouth, New Hampshire fisheries, 1870. 10 vessels, that means schooners. 40 small boats, 100 men in the winter. It's estimated that over 1 million pounds of codfish been landed at one wharf. 1 million pounds at one wharf. In and about the harbor, this is the crackerjack. There is now sunk 63 miles of long lines, on which are hung 96,000 hooks. So think of this. 15 years before, all the fishing had been done hand lining, and you couldn't get 96,000 hooks. Okay? But now you're stretching out long lines, and you're going out in boats and stretching long lines that have hundreds and hundreds of hooks, and a lot of boats. They're saturating the area, and they're catching cod at this rate. So what do we have then? We have a fishery that had depended on a certain gear, hand lines, for a very long time. And as catches fell in the mid-century, 1850s, 1860s, then we got to do something. We don't have enough fish. We'll go to a new technology. More homes. Okay? Seems to us like a pretty simple change, but it actually increased the effort dramatically. And this is what happened. We'll just run the story ahead a little bit. What would the next technology be? Well, what if we went to gill nets? Okay. What if we went to draggers? Okay. What if we went to draggers with electronic fish finders? Okay. At every step of the way, everyone knew that there were fewer fish. Everyone knew that the fisheries was in trouble. The paper trail is voluminous. It's the fishermen that are bitching about it. It's the local people in towns like Boothbay and Gloucester and Portland that are concerned. And yet they resolved the problem by adopting a more efficient technology. That's good. Sometimes even a safer technology, put engines in fishing boats. Not so many guys die. Oh, that's better. But not coupling those improvements in technology to any kind of better management of the fishery. That wasn't so good. So, industrial interests overwhelm local conservationists. That's just part of the story towards the end here. We have the crashes that occur. 1879, the menhaden crash, then the mackerel crash, then the halibut crash, and then the lobster crash. 3 of these 4 species hadn't even been fished in the colonial period. So they'd only been fished for about 75 years, even less in some cases, and they've been pushed to commercial extinction. This got the attention of local politicians and fishermen. You see the mackerel catch numbers here. Flat zone. Oops. Well, so by 1900, even small-scale inshore fishermen are using technology of the kind that their fathers had protested. And there's a recognition that just as New Englanders had changed the land, so were they changing the sea. We get to the end of this talk now, which is towards World War I. Remember, 1873, Spencer Baird had argued for the restoration of our exhausted cod fishery. It never happened. Here's the Gulf of Maine cod draft. Today, of course, it's down here. 1912. Congressman from Massachusetts introduces into the U.S. Congress legislation that would make it illegal to land in the United States any fish caught by a dragger or a trawler. The entire Gloucester Board of Trade backs the bill. The mayor of Boston, John Fitzgerald, says, I'm the mayor of the largest fishing port in the Western Hemisphere. I think this is a good idea because I've been over Europe and I've seen what they've done with these trawlers and they made a hell of a mess, so we shouldn't do it. So what we have is the yeah, that's Honey Fitz. That's Jack Kenny's grandfather. We have the entire fishing industry standing up as one man, in effect, telling the Congress, yeah, pass Congressman Gardner's bill. Don't allow these trawlers in. There were at that point, I think, 2, maybe just 1. I can't remember. The first one's 1906. That's a spray. It's ocean bay fishing. But anyway, there's a handful of these trawlers. So what happens? Well, the Congress dithers and farms out a study and blah, 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 but they do not make this fishery illegal. In 1914, the New York Times publishes this article, "Extermination Threatens American Sea Fisheries. Cost to consumer has risen because decrease in supply." They just connected the dots over the data of the last 40 years. And so now what happened? In spite of serious opposition, by about 1925, otter trolling was the new normal. The new normal, and the fishing industry rallied around it. And the last thing I'm going to tell you is this. We've been having the same conversation now for 160 years about whether there will be fish for the future, what we should do about it. For the first 80 years, it was the fishermen who were on the side of conservation, the fishermen who were on the side of fixing it, the fishermen who were on the side of making the situation better. In the 1920s, 1930s, things changed. In 1925-26, the year classes of haddock out at Georges Bank were really poor, and the scientists from Woods Hole said, there's hardly any babies, so they're not going to grow up into these bigger fish, so we should really throttle back. Bigger mesh, let the babies escape, don't fish as hard, And the fishermen, who only 15 years before had been absolutely opposed to this trawling technology, now they're out there trawling like hell. They say, no, if we don't catch them, the Canadians will. So the sides switched over this haddock controversy in the late 20s and the early 30s. And the scientists who heretofore had been fish harder, we'll solve the problems, we're here to understand the ecosystem and make it for just fish harder. And the fishermen were like, well, wait a minute, we got 1930, they switched. And the fishermen started saying, fish on, press on. And the scientists started saying, no, put the brakes on. Conversation's the same. It's just the sides switched. But we've been doing this for 160 years. Okay. So, we hit that fish until they were almost gone, but we had no. So, last slide here. Authors always, are pleased when reviewers sort of get it. So after this book came out, it got reviewed in the Washington Post. I had this fantasy that every member of the U.S. Congress was waking up that morning with his coffee and reading the review in the Washington Post of my book. And the review by Jonathan Yardley, the last two lines of it said this. The first sentence I wrote, I'm going to read it to you, and then the second sentence he wrote. So my sentence from the end of my book. Ultimately, the scale of this story, spanning centuries and stretching across the North Atlantic, reveals, as few other tales can, the tragic consequences of decision-makers' unwillingness to steer a precautionary course in the face of environmental uncertainty. That was me. And then Yardley wrote, anyone who thinks that passage, or this book, is only about fish, is living in a fool's paradise. He got it. Thank you. You're welcome.